Hey, Kevin here, Skylabs, bringing you another video. Definitely gonna be a fun one. And in this video, we're gonna go over something we hear a lot, and that is, how do you get that tube sound? And really the short answer is with tube amplification. And in this video, we'll go over some of the sound differences between tubes and solid state, some of the misconceptions we hear from our customers regarding tubes, and we'll also give you a couple recommendations for those of you out there that think you might want to try a vintage tube amplifier or receiver. And before we get into this video real quick, we got new shirts in. We've got 3 new designs that we're going to start selling on our website. These are from us. They are made in Des Moines, Iowa. We will be shipping them out ourselves. And because we are so excited about these new shirts, this week we're going to do a 15% off sale. At some point in this video, I'll post up a code that gets you that discount. So go check them out. And with that, we'll get into the video. What's the difference between solid state and tube amplification without getting too technical? I think it's kind of a trade-off. I definitely think tubes do some things better than solid state, and solid state does some things better than tubes. That is why I have both. I do have a theory on some of the earlier 70s models having kind of a tube-like sound. And with VFET transistors, you can get a more tube-like sound. I don't want to get too far into that. And for those of you out there that already have your daily driver solid state piece, or maybe you have 3 or 4 because we know how this hobby is, rather than getting another solid state receiver, you might want to think about grabbing a tube amplifier. And the benefits for me with tubes, I think sonically would be, they definitely have that warm sound. They've got a more lifelike sound stage. It has a lot of depth. There's something really natural about the tube sound stage that is different from solid state. And with tubes, I really like listening to music that was pre-70s recorded on tube gear, really mixed and mastered for tube gear. So for me, it just works as kind of a general rule. But really anything, jazzy, orchestral, acoustic instruments always sound really good on tubes. They sound really lifelike. Female vocals, really intimate recordings, I think I prefer on tubes. There's just something about it that just lends itself really well to that type of music. However, the one drawback to tubes, they don't do big bursts of bass energy very well. It's not very fast. It's kind of sluggish. It feels like it gets a little bit sloppy. And solid state is not completely different. It's not sterile. It doesn't have to be. It shouldn't be. For me with solid state, I do feel like there's more detail in the instruments. I can kind of place where things are in the sound stage. There's no real haze or warmth over it. Everything is clean and pristine. And that doesn't mean it sounds bad. I think that term warm really gets used in the wrong way. With some things, I don't think warmth is a good thing. Sometimes I really like clean and pristine and fast and just a true representation of the recording without any colorization. Because in my opinion, I do think tubes kind of color the sound in a way. That's the warmth, is the coloration. And solid state handles big bursts of energy very well. Big bass notes, fast bass notes. Solid state it seems more quick, more peppery. So for electronic music or fast-paced music, especially with a fast-paced kick drum, solid state's right there. It doesn't get that slurry to it the way tube amplifiers do. I don't like listening to Metallica on a tube amplifier. I know there's a lot of generalities there, but without getting too technical, that's the way I think of tube amplification versus solid state. And you could have a completely different opinion because of a different piece of gear that really do emulate tubes very well. And vice versa. I think there are some tube amplifiers, especially modern ones, that really don't have a lot of warmth to them. They're more on the clinical side. So take it with a grain of salt. This is just my opinion on the way they sound. So let's get into some of the misconceptions we hear at the shop a lot, because people tend to get this glazed look or a panic look on their face if I'm showing them a tube receiver or amplifier. So let's go over a couple of these points that I think might have been holding you back from actually diving into the tube world. And the first one is cost. And this is one thing we hear quite a bit is, oh, tubes are too expensive. I don't want to have to deal with replacing them when they need replaced. Some of that's true. Yes, some tubes are very expensive, but for the most part, most common tubes, especially the ones that are also used in guitar amplifiers and studio gear, are really actually inexpensive. Like 12AX7s, 12AU7s, 6L6s, the more common tubes, which are used in a lot of vintage stereo equipment, are really easy to come by. And it also gives you another level of being able to change the sound of your amplifier, which you cannot do with solid state. You can actually buy tubes, it's called tube rolling, and put different tubes in your amplifier or receiver to kind of change the sound if you want to tailor it to your taste. And with a quick little bit of research, you can get online, look at the tube complement of the receiver or the amplifier that you're looking to purchase, and see what those tubes are going for. So just do a little bit of homework or ask the person you're buying it from, are these tubes readily available and how expensive are they? It's a good thing to know before you go in. And from what we're seeing in the shop and online, it doesn't seem like the tube amplifiers are really increasing in value like the solid state ones have. Looking at models by Fisher and Heathkit, Dynaco, it does not seem like the tube amplifiers and receivers are going up at the same rate as solid state. Picking up a decent serviced vintage tube amplifier might not be as expensive as you thought. You just want to do a little bit of research, find one that works for you, and we'll give you a couple recommendations here towards the end of the video. Another really economical solution would be to do what people have been doing for 50, 60 years, and that's build your own kit. They have been making tube amplifier kits since tube amplifiers were available. A lot of Heathkit and Dynaco, those came from kits, and they still make those today. Check out Tube Depot, they seem to have a lot of them, or Bottlehead is another one. For some of you that might be retired, you love the vintage audio, maybe thinking about dabbling in some repairs, a tube amplifier kit would be a really cool and fun way to kind of dip your toe in those waters. Not to mention the ability to sit back and really enjoy something that you built would have to be rewarding. I can't see how it wouldn't be. And another really cost-effective way to get into tube gear would be look at Chi-Fi gear. There's a lot of tube amplifiers and preamplifiers coming out of China. There's even a Facebook group that I'm a part of called Chi-Fi Corner, where people talk about the products, what's good, what's not good. And most of these amplifiers can be picked up pretty cheap, already assembled, out of the box. And it's a really good way to maybe see if tubes are right for you in a really inexpensive way. Just because it's a tube amplifier doesn't mean it has to be expensive. There are some economical ways to get into the tube side of audio. And this is definitely kind of a misconception. I've had 15, 20 watt per channel tube amplifiers, and I've driven lots of speakers with them and never sat back and went, I need more power. There are going to be some speakers that would definitely struggle with a tube amplifier, but for the most part, a good vintage set of speakers. I ran ADS L810s, JBL Jubals, 2AXs, all kinds of speakers, and never thought I needed more power, even with something as small as like a 10 watt per channel vintage tube amplifier. And tube amplifiers are different than solid state in that when tube amplifiers distort, it's actually pleasant to our ears. Solid state distortion is terrible. And so I find myself being able to really crank up a tube amplifier way past what I would with a solid state one and still enjoy the sound, if not even more. Engineers and musicians have been overdriving tubes since the beginning of tubes to get that good tube distortion. Even so much, I watched an interview with one of the engineers from Abbey Road not too long ago, and he said something interesting where he said when they switched over to solid state consoles in the late 60s, a lot of the engineers really struggled with them because they were used to overdriving the tubes to get that vocal sound or that drum overhead sound they wanted. And when they went to solid state, they were kind of having to learn how to record on solid state because it is different. It's different going in and it's different going out. Solid state and tubes are completely different in that way. Tube distortion sounds good. Solid state distortion does not. If you do like to play your music really loud, and I get it, maybe just think about going to a really efficient speaker, something from the Klipsch line or a Cerwin Vega or something like that. But for the most part, every speaker I put on them, I haven't had any issues. And I think the fear of repairability is probably the biggest misconception with tubes, and that, especially with vintage tube amplifiers, they are so simple in design. A lot of them are point-to-point wiring, meaning from one component to the other one is a piece of wire, rather than a circuit board, which over time can pull solder traces or, because of the heat generated, can bow and start to crack. Tube amplifiers are just way more simple in design than most solid-state amplifiers. There's a reason why they've been making kits to build tube amplifiers for this long. The one thing you do want to keep in mind with a vintage tube amplifier receiver is there are a lot of high voltages in there, unlike solid-state. So you really want to be careful. Don't go poking or prodding around in a vintage tube amplifier if you don't know what you're doing. There are lethal voltages in there, which also means it is really important to change out those capacitors and make sure that tube amplifier is in good working condition. A lot of these vintage tube amplifiers are full of wax capacitors, and with these high voltages going through them, to me, it is paramount to get those changed. If you're not tech savvy, make sure you're buying a serviced tube amplifier, or make sure you're going to get it serviced. Because I've had people come in and they'll say, I've got a vintage tube amplifier and it's never skipped a beat. It works great to this day and it's over 50 years old. My recommendation is I would unplug that thing from the wall or put it on a power strip and toggle the power to it if I was leaving the room. There's just too many possibilities with that much current in this circuitry to not service it or to not get it back into spec. Just a quick disclaimer there. There's definitely been a couple hiccups in the supply chain like everything else in the last couple of years, including capacitors. It does seem like most tubes are back in stock and readily available. There for a while there were sanctions on Russia that was keeping us from being able to get tubes. And then there was a fire at one of the Chinese tube manufacturing plants. But in good news to this, Western Electric has started manufacturing tubes again in Georgia. So as they ramp up their manufacturing, you're going to start seeing a lot more tubes readily available, at least from the United States. And that's always a good thing. Hopefully that happens sooner than later, and we have access again to almost any tube we could want. And with the average lifespan of a tube being 10,000 hours or so, you really don't have to change them that often, unless you want to change the sound or the colorization of your amplifier. 10,000 hours is a really good amount of time, in my opinion, for a tube that might cost $20 to $50. And for those of you that are ready to dive into the vintage tube world, we've got a couple recommendations for you, especially if you live in the United States. Both of these models are readily available. You can pick them up fairly cheap, get them serviced reasonably cheap, and one of these might be a really great way for you to get into the world of vintage tube audio. And our first pick is the Fisher 400, although really any of the Fisher line stuff from the 100, 500, 800 are great. It just seems like there are a lot of Fisher 400s out there, and there's a lot of really good information on servicing one. The Model 400 was manufactured between 1967 and 1968. Subtube enthusiasts rank it to be one of the finest FM receivers ever made, with a power output of 25 watts per channel into 8 ohms. One thing to consider with the Fisher 400 is you're not going to have a lot of choices when it comes to new output tubes. Electro Harmonics right now is your only option, but with Western Electric ramping up, maybe they'll add this to their product line, and that would be really nice. I've owned a Fisher 400 for over 10 years now. It's kind of the first receiver I think about when somebody says vintage tube receiver. We've had lots of these come through the shop for repair or for sale. I don't remember the technicians struggling to fix these or get them working. Really, besides replacing the capacitors, getting some tubes replaced, the only thing we ever really run into is sometimes the volume pot has deteriorated to a place where it needs replaced. And there are brand new ones available. They're not cheap, but in the grand scheme of things, a really nice serviced Fisher 400 with a new volume pot, that's tough to beat, especially for the price you're going to be able to get it for. If you'd rather have a receiver than an amplifier, check out the Fisher 400. Otherwise, we'll give you our amplifier pick, which is the Dynaco ST70. And the Dynaco ST70 was in production for over 20 years, which is crazy. They were in production from the 60s through the 70s. More than 400,000 ST70s were sold in kit and assembled forms. Total sales by some estimates approaching 500,000 by 1977. That would make the ST70 the most popular tube amplifier of all time. It sold well not only in the United States, but also in Europe and Japan. The Dynaco ST70 is 35 watts per channel into 8 ohms. There are so many good things that could be said about the Dynaco ST70 and its simplicity, its sound, its longevity. There are so many mods and kits and repair forums that it might be the best vintage tube amplifier to own for a first-time tube buyer. As far as I know, they're still in production today. There are actual websites dedicated to this amplifier. And like I said, the amount of modifications you can do on an ST70 is really crazy. If you're looking for a vintage tube amplifier, definitely consider the Dynaco ST70. It is as classic gets. So if you're the type of person that likes jazz music, orchestral, acoustic sounds, more intimate recordings, or stuff produced before the 1970s, I can't recommend a vintage tube amplifier for you more. I think you'll be really surprised at the difference there is with tubes over solid state, especially in those applications. If you've already got your main system, you've already got your daily driver, definitely consider grabbing a piece of tube gear and seeing what all the hype's about. And I do think the hype is warranted. And thanks for making it to the end of another video. Thank you very much for all you that liked, subscribed, shared. We do appreciate it very much. And we'll see you in the next one. Thanks.